How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf 30, Daf Lamed, Daf 30 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, yo friends. Today is gonna be all about Pigul, right? I have no clue what's been flying for the last month. Ever since, I'd say before Rosh Hashanah. It's right now Simchas Torah. Today the hostages came home, and thank God, thank you Hashem. And there's like a lot going on. There's like a bunch of people right there. Maybe you can hear them. Hopefully I won't be able to hear them. There's just a lot going on. Anyways, it's Simchas Torah. This is like the pinnacle of all the last like month. I have no clue what's going on. It's right now Monday. I haven't recorded since Friday. This is all to say I have no clue what's flying. I don't know what we've done. I feel like the last daf that we did, we already got into Pigul. Who knows? Maybe 2 dafs ago. I have no clue what's flying. However, I do know that today's daf is all about Pigul. I do know. So today's daf, I think, is a continuation of what we kind of started maybe yesterday. I think probably actually the day before, maybe even the day before that. Again, I don't know. But this is a continuation of like Pigul. I think we got started with Pigul. This is a continuation of that. I think it's going to be a long and difficult daf, is my guess. I will jump into the introduction, and I think from the introduction, you might be able to sense why I think it might be a long and difficult daf, but it's also going to be a great daf. And hopefully I'll be able to focus. That I think that's going to be key to successfully navigating the circumstances. Sheesh. Okay. Wow. Yeah, it's just insane how everything's going. It's right now 2:30 in the afternoon. Shabbos starts in 3 hours. Within the next 3 hours, I have to record this very long daf and edit it and upload it because it's tomorrow's daf already. Absolutely insane. I'm like literally barely hanging on. Okay, here we go. The first section of today's daf is Karev hamatir k'mitzvaso. An important halacha of Pigul, which we have referred to already, I believe, which is essentially that if you have a machsheves Pigul by one of the avodahs, right? Pigul specifically referring to chutz lizmana, which is a chiyuv kzayis. So let's say you slaughter a korban with the intention of eating it beyond its allowed eating time. So in order for it to be Pigul, in order for you to be chayiv kzayis, you would also have to do the Kabbalah, halacha, and zrika, like in an all good kind of way. But if let's say you do the Kabbalah sadam with the intention of eating it chutz limkomo, well then it would no longer be chayiv kzayis. It would be simply Pigul. It would be a lav. It would be posel. But there would be no chiyuv kzayis. So we're going to start off today with a Mishnah that is going to talk all about that. Now, the next section is Tfos, lashon, rishon, 1 avodah versus 2 avodahs. Basically, in the Mishnah, at the end of the Mishnah, of this kind of longish Mishnah that we are going to learn all about Karev hamatir k'mitzvaso. So towards the end of that Mishnah, we're going to get to a machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion is Tfos lashon rishon. We go based on what he. Interesting. He's not really necessarily saying anything now, but we're going based on the first thing that happened. Let's say we'll get to it in the Mishnah. Basically, the entirety of this daf is going to be working through that shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Be working through that shita of Reb Yehuda about where exactly he says Tfos lashon rishon. So in this first instance, we have Tfos lashon rishon. Are we talking about 1 avodah versus 2 avodahs? Okay, so if he has, if he has intention chutz lizmano and then he has intention chutz limkomo, is that talking about both of those intentions during shechita, or maybe one's during shechita, one's during Kabbalah? So that is going to be the first sugya we're going to get to. The next sugya is going to be Tfos lashon rishon, 2 thoughts for one avodah. I told you from the introduction, you'll be able to see why this is going to be a complex daf. So yeah, this has to do with like, what if he's kind of explicit that he's trying to kind of divide up let's say, an avodah, would Rabbi still say Tfos lashon rishon? We're gonna have to work through all this stuff, Chaver. Right now it doesn't mean that much, but these are kind of the just Roshei Prokim. Rab Meir versus Rab Yossi when it comes to temurah. Whenever temurah comes up, you're in for a good time. So temurah, when you you say, I'm going to bring this as a korban, and then you say, wait, actually I want to bring that animal instead. That's what's called temurah. We are going to work through that. That's an exciting sugya. And finally, Tfos lashon rishon, 2 thoughts for 1 kzayis. Sheesh! This is going to be, oh my gosh, this is going to be a daf. Oh, yeah, I'm a little nervous because it's 2:40 in the afternoon. This daf needs to be recorded, edited, and uploaded in the next 3 hours. I'm nervous. I'm just that this daf is going to take 2 hours to record. and editing these days takes a long time with the slides and everything. Anyways, this is what we have in mind. This is what we have in line. This is what we have set up for us for daf Lamed of Masechta Zevachim. Here we go. It's going to be an exciting daf. Let's do it. All right, friends. We are going to begin on daf Chavtes Amid Beis. We got about half an Amid to do there on daf Chavtes Amid Beis because the last daf I recorded was right before Shabbat. These days are berserk. It's just insane. I'm sure I'm not the only one going through this now. Everyone's going through this. Every day is Yom Tov, Erev Yom Tov. It's insanity. Anyways, so okay, we're on Daf Chavtes Amud Beis at the Mishnah, about halfway through the Amud. Says the Mishnah, Ze'aklal, this is the rule. Kol ha'shoichit, anybody who slaughters, v'amakab, v'amalach, v'azorek, we know about these things. Anyone who does any of the avodas adams, lechol davar shedarko lechol, to eat epis that you normally eat, i.e. meat, right? On a korban, there's meat, there's a murin, there's the part of the animal that you normally burn on the mizbeach. So if the intention is to eat something that's normally eaten, or if the intention was to burn something that is meant to be burnt, the emurin. You could skip the word kzayis. Chutz limkomo. If the intention was to eat the meat outside of its proper place, so by kachim, that means outside of the Azar. By kachim kalim means outside of Yerushalayim. Posel ve'im bo karis. So when it comes to chutz limkomo, the korban is posel, but there's no chiyuv karis. The korban is posel, but there's no chiyuv karis. Chutz lizmano, but if the intention was to eat, where am I? Chutz limkomo posel ve'im bo karis. Chutz lizmano, if the intention was to eat the korban. Wait, what? I feel like I skipped something. In the previous thing, so in terms of eating, so it has to be eaten in Yerushalayim. So kachim is in the Azar, kachim kalim is anywhere in Yerushalayim. But in terms of burning, it's of course going to have to be in the Azar. Now, in terms of chutz lizmano, however, right? So chutz lizmano, if the intention was to, let's say, to eat the meat outside of its allotted time, so let's say we're talking about a korban shlam, so you have 2 days to eat a korban shlam. So if you slaughter the korban with the intention to eat it after 3 days, for example, so then that would be chutz lizmano. Alternatively, to burn it, you have to burn it by the next morning. You have to burn it. So if the intention is to burn the emurin the next day or something, that would be chutz. Both of those would be examples of chutz lizmano. Pigul. The chayav and olive karis. In that case, when it comes to chutz lizmano, there's actually a chayav karis. So by chutz limkomo, so both are kind of referred to as pigul. It's funny, but both are kind of referred to as pigul, right? Chutz limkomo is also referred to as pigul. However, chutz lizmano is like really pigul, right? It's like when you talk about pigul that you chayav karis for, that's chutz lizmano, right? Or like, for example, if you notice here in the Mishnah, when it was talking about chutz limkomo, it says posel ve'em bo karis. When it says to chutz lizmano, it says pigul v'chayav and olav karis. So it's a little bit, I don't know if the word is tricky, but here it's referring to chutz limkomo as posel, and it's referring to chutz lizmano as pigul, implying that chutz limkomo isn't pigul. But at the same time, as we've learned in the past, right, in the past few days, that we actually learned out chutz lizmano from shlishi in the word shlishi in the pasuk, and we learn chutz limkomo from the word pigul in the pasuk, and so we also do refer to chutz lizmano to chutz limkomo as pigul as well. But as you see here, it's specifically referring to chutz. We refer to chutz limkomo as pigul as well, but here it's specifically referring to chutz lizmano as pigul. But either way, chutz lizmano is going to be the one that you're chayiv kares for, as we've learned about at length recently. However, in order to be chayiv kares, the matir has to be offered properly, and the matir is be'etzem the avodah adam. The shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika. So if you're gonna slaughter a korban with machshavas chutz lizmano, you're only gonna be chayiv kares, and it's only gonna be considered pigul if all of the other avodahs, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, are done kosherly. But if they are done, if the kabbalah was, let's say, done with the intention of chutz limkomo now, well, that's gonna ruin the chiyuv kares for the chutz lizmano of the shchita. Okay. So Kate said karev hamatir k'mitzvah. So what would be an example of karev hamatir k'mitzvah? So, for example, shachat b'shsika. For example, if the korban was slaughtered without any machshava, without any thoughts, inappropriate thoughts of chutz lizmano, but kiba valach v'zarek chutz lizmano, but the kabbalah, halacha, and zrika were done with kavana of chutz lizmano, or sheshachat chutz lizmano, or the shchita was chutz lizmano, the kiba valach v'zarek b'shtika, but then the rest of the avodas were done with no special intention at all, just regular kosher intention. Oh, sheshachat v'kiba v'halach v'zarek chutz lizmano, or he did all of the things, like shchita, kabbalah, halacha, zrika, all of them with intention of the singular intention of chutz lizmano, that I'm going to eat it when it's too late. And all of those examples would be karev hamatir k'mitzvaso, right? That there was basically one inappropriate thought throughout, which was, I am going to eat this korban chutz lizmano. There was at no stage was there any intention of chutz limkomo, for example. Right? So you slaughtered it with the intention of chutz lizmano, and the rest of the avodas were done kosherly. Or all of the avodas were done with that same intention of chutz lizmano, etc. But it's kind of one inappropriate pigul machshava, and nothing else. Now we're going to see what it means. Ketzad lo karev hamatir k'mitzvaso. Correct the Mishnah. So now what would it look like? Shelo karev hamatir k'mitzvaso. Well, shachat chutz limkomo. Okay, well, what if the shchita was chutz limkomo? Kibel v'halach v'zarek chutz lizmano, and then the kabbalah, halacha, and zrika were chutz lizmano. So now you have two things going on. You have chutz. It's not just chutz lizmano. You also had kavanah of chutz limkomo. So the chutz limkomo kavanah machshava that got involved, that got mixed in there during the avodah adam is going to mean that that there's no chiyuv kares. Or sheshachat chutz lizmano, or if the shchita was chutz lizmano, but then kiba v'halach v'zarek chutz limkomo, but the kabbalah halacha zrika was chutz limkomo. Or sheshachat v'kiba v'halach v'zarek chutz limkomo. Alternatively, simply, if all four avodas were chutz limkomo, there's not going to be a chiyuv kares either, because chiyuv kares is dafka chutz lizmano, not chutz limkomo. Okay, so again, in order to be karev hamatir k'mitzvaso, there would have to be simply a kavana of chutz lizmano. If there's chutz lizmano paired together with chutz limkomo at any point, or if it's entirely chutz limkomo, then there's not going to be any chiyuv kares. Now, apesach ve'achatos sheshchoten shelo lishman. Now, as we know, of course, from the first Mishnah in Masechta Zevachim already a month ago nearly. It's already 4 weeks ago now. If you can imagine. Well, it's been a busy 4 weeks. Not just the fact that Zevachim is particularly challenging, but also it's been a challenging time of the calendar. But anyways, Pesach v'achatos sheshchoten shelo lishman says, we learned in the first Mishnah of Masechta Zevachim, of course, right, I'm referencing the first Mishnah. The exceptions being Korban Chatos and Korban Pesach. Korban Chatos, Korban Pesach must be slaughtered, as we know, with the have to be slaughtered lishman. And if it's shelo lishman, then they're pasul. So a pesach v'chatas sheshchotin shelo lishman. If you have a korban pesach or korban chatas that was slaughtered shelo lishman, the kibel v'halach v'zarak chutz lizmanu, and then kabbalah halacha zrika were shelo lizmanu, chutz lizmanu, or sheshachar chutz lizmanu, or maybe the shchita was chutz lizmanu, kibel v'halach v'zarak shelo lishman, but then the kabbalah halacha zrika was shelo lishman. So again, in this scenario also, you have as part of the avodah sadam another issue that is arising. In this case, it's being the fact that the korban chatas or korban pesach was slaughtered shelo lishma. Or shachad v'kibel v'halach v'zarak daman. Wait, well, I think you could skip the word daman. Yeah. Again, where am I? Kibel, okay. Or shachad v'kibel v'halach v'zarak shelo lishman. Or if all the avodas were pashut shelo lishman, because that's not a chiyuv kares, it's just the animal will be pasul. In all of those scenarios, that would be lo karev hamatir k'mitzvaso, meaning there would be no chiyuv kares. It would not be considered pigul that you'd be chayiv kares for. Chavi, like my yarmulke? I just made it. I made it over Chol Hamoed. It's a kippah with the Babble on Talmud logo on it. Now I have a branded kippah. Continues the Mishnah, lechol kzayis bachutz, kzayis l'machos. So now we are approaching the machlokas between the Tanakama and Reb Yehuda, which is essentially going to be really the focus of today's Gemara. So lechol kzayis bachutz, kzayis l'machor. Wow, this is going to be a big part of today's daf. If the kavana, so let's say a korban was slaughtered with the kavana to eat a kzayis of the korban outside of where you're allowed to. So let's say it's a kachei kachim, so outside of the azara. So bachutz, kzayis l'machor, and another kzayis, the intention is to eat it tomorrow, which is chutz lizmanu. So you have, for one, so you slaughter the korban, let's say, the kavana is to eat one kzayis chutz limkomo, and one kzayis chutz lizmanu. Kzayis l'machor, kzayis b'chutz, or alternatively, to eat one, vice versa, to eat one kzayis chutz lizmanu and one kzayis chutz limkomo. Kachatzi zayis b'chutz, kachatzi zayis l'machor. Interestingly, half a zayis chutz limkomo and half a zayis chutz lizmanu. So here they are joining together to create a kzayis. Kachatzi zayis l'machor, kachatzi zayis b'chutz. Alternatively, vice versa, half a zayis chutz lizmanu, half a zayis chutz limkomo. Pasul ve'en bokar. So in all of those scenarios, so the korban is pasul and there's no chiyuv kares, right? Because you have combinations of chutz lizmanu and chutz limkomo. It's not purely chutz lizmanu. Now there's going to be in the machlokas right out of the gate in the Gemara. There's going to be machlokas in a few minutes between Ilfa and Rabbi Yochanan about, is this kzayis, right? Kzayis limachor, kzayis bachutz. Are we talking about for the same avodah, like he slaughtered it to the kavana of eating one kzayis tomorrow and one kzayis outside of where you're allowed to, let's say outside of the zar for kachim, or is, let's say the shchita was chutz lizmano and the kabbalah was chutz limkomo. So we're going to discuss what exactly we're talking about with these kzayis this, kzayis that. Is it one avodah, two is spread out across two avodas? But anyways, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, now importantly, crucially for today's daf, says Rabbi Yehuda, Zeh HaKlal, this is actually the rule, Kol shemachsheves hazman kodma lemachsheves hamakim Pigul v'chayav and olav kares v'machsheves hamakim kodma lemachsheves hazman pasul ve'en bo kares. So Rabbi Yehuda applies this concept of Tfos lashon rishon, that you go with the first thing, in this case the first machshava. So if initially, right? So if it was kzayis limachar, kzayis bachutz, if the first kzayis the intention was chutz lizmano, and the second, which is pigul, Let's call it, in this case, we'll call it Pigul and Puzzle. Right? Chutz Lizmano is Pigul, Chutz Limkomo is Puzzle. So since if the first Kavanah was Chutz Lizmano, which is Pigul and you're chayiv kares for it, and the second Kavanah was Chutz Limkomo, which is Puzzle and you're not chayiv kares, well, since the first Kavanah was Chutz Lizmano, which is Pigul, and it's a chiyuv kares, so we go with that according to Rabbi Yehuda, and you'd be chayiv kares, even though you followed it up with Chutz Limkomo. If it was vice versa, and the first intention was Chutz Limkomo, which is Puzzle and there's no chiyuv kares, followed by Chutz Lizmano, then there would be no chiyuv kares. So Tfos, lashon, rishon, we go based on what happens first. If Chutz Lizmano is first, kares. If Chutz Limkomo is first, it's Chutz Limkomo is first, no chiyuv kares, simply Puzzle. So again, Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, Zaklal, this is the rule. Kol shemachsheves hazman, kodem lachsheves hamokim. If Chutz Lizmano precedes Chutz Limkomo, Pigul v'chayiv and of kares, then there's a chiyuv kares. However, v'machsheves hamokim, kodem lachsheves hazman, but if Chutz Limkomo precedes Chutz Lizmano, Puzzle v'embo kares, then it's Puzzle and there's no chiyuv kares. Whereas the Chacham say, Zevozeh, Puzzle v'embo kares. The Chacham say, meh, order doesn't matter. Even if Chutz Lizmano was foished, even if Chutz Lizmano was first, there's no chiyuv kares since it was followed up by Chutz Limkomo. And finally, lechol kachatzi zayis lahaktir kachatzi zayis. Kosher she'ena chilav aktor mitzdarfen. So the final clause in the Mishnah is that if the kavanah was to eat half a zayis, let's say Chutz Lizmano, and to burn half a zayis, Chutz Lizmano, so each kavanah alone, each machshava alone, was insufficient because there wasn't a shir, there was no zayis. But Tzazamin, there is a kzayis, but the first kavanah was about eating, the second kavanah was about burning. So we're saying the korban is completely kosher because eating and burning, you can't add them together. You can't add; they're incompatible. So again, lechol kachatzi zayis, lahaktir kachatzi zayis. So if the kavanah was, let's say I'm slaughtering this, without getting into the machlokas about is this kavanah by two avodas, one avodas, let's just pretend like that's not a machlokas right now. And I'm just going to say, okay, so he slaughters a korban with the intention of eating half a zayis, chutz lizmano, and burning half a zayis, chutz lizmano. Kosher she'en achilav aktar mitzdarfin. The korban is kosher because eating and burning are incompatible. They can't join together to make the korban possible. All right, so now we're moving on to the Gemara in the next section of today's daf. Tfos, lashon, rishon, one avodah versus two avodahs. Now that we've seen the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says Tfos, lashon, rishon, right, but it's in the machlokus between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon is with regard, do we say Tfos, lashon, rishon, like Rabbi Yehuda says, which is that if the initial kavanah was chutz lizmano followed by chutz limkomo, there will be a chiyuv kares because we go based on the first thing of chutz lizmano in this case. Now the Chacham say no, it's what's called eruv machshavas, that instead of giving precedence to the first one, we say we join them both together. In which case there was kavan of chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo, so it's not going to be a chiyuv kares, it's going to be chiyuv pasul because we joined them both together. We joined the two machshavas, the two kavanas together. So the question now is, how far does Rabbi Yehuda go with his shita of Tfos, lashon, rishon? Right? Tfos, lashon, rishon kind of implies that there were two separate, let's say, kavanas, two distinct kavana machshavas, and therefore we're gonna focus only on the first one. Now, now would Rabbi Yehuda only say that, for example, if we're talking about two separate avodas, right? So, for example, if there was shchita with the kavanah of chutz lizmano, and then kabbalah with the kavanah with the machshava of chutz limkomo. So if they say, look, in that situation, you had one kavanah by the shchita, another kavanah by the kabbalah. Those were two separate machshavas. I think I would prefer to say machshava than versus kavana, but if I say kavana, I mean machshava. They're probably the same thing. But anyways, so you had one machshava during shchita, another machshava during Kabbalah. So do we say, okay, in that case, so Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, you go based on the first one during shchita. But what if you had during shchita you had two kavanas, one of chutz lizmano, followed by chutz l'mkomo, within the same avodah? So in that case, would Rabbi Yehuda still say we go based on the first machshava? Or in that case, would he agree with the rabbis and say eruv machshavos, and we would say that you would not be chayiv kares? And this is basically going to be the theme throughout the daf, really, that we're going to be working throughout the daf, of how far does Rabbi Yehuda go with Tfos lashon rishon versus saying, you know what, over here, actually, I agree, it's eruv machshavos. So the first place that we're going to come, that we're going to experience this, is with regard to that question that I just raised, of does Rabbi Yehuda only say Tfos lashon rishon by two distinct avodahs, or would he even say it within one avodah? I have no clue what they're getting excited about outside. Is Trump still speaking? It sounds like they're watching like a football game, but they might just be watching Trump's speech. But I don't know if he's speaking. Must have been speaking for a long time already. Anyways, I don't know. Says the Gemara, Omar Ilfa. Says Ilfa, machlokes b'shtei avodah. So says Ilfa that the machlokes, and really what we're interested in, when we talk about the machlokes, really what we're interested in Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that Rabbi Yehuda is only going to say his shita of Tfos lashon rishon when we're talking about two distinct avodahs. Avo ba'avodah achas. But if we're talking about one avodah, let's say he does the shchita first with the kavanah of chutz lizmano, followed by a kavanah of chutz l'mkomo within the shchita, divrei hakol erev machshavos. Everybody agrees that's erev machshavos. Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it's not two distinct machshavos, it's one, it's a double machshava, and there wouldn't be no chiyuv kares. Have. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees with Ilfa, and he says, Af ba'avodah achas machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan says that even within one avodah, if he simply does the shchita with kavanah of chutz lizmano and chutz l'mkomo, still, Rabbi Yehuda would say there, Tfos lashon rishon, and if the initial kavanah was chutz lizmano, it would be a chiyuv kares, even if both machshavos were within the same avodah. Bishtam le'ilfa midereisha b'shtei avodahs sefer now b'shtei avodahs. So now says the Gemara initially says that that it prefers ilfa's shita for consistency, because if you look, for example, 3 lines before it gets wide. If you look, for example, 3 lines before it gets wide, we're still on Daf Chav Tes and Beis. How long has it been? I think it's been a half an hour already, or 25 minutes. We're still on Chav Tes. We haven't got the Lamed yet. Anyways, so if you look 3 lines before it gets wide on Daf Chav Tes, Ketzad lo Karev hamatir k'mitzvah. So what are we saying? Not Karev hamatir k'mitzvah, so and there would be no chiyuv kares. Shachad chutz l'mkomo kibo balach v'zar chutz l'zmano. Kilu the chutz l'mkomo, the chutz l'zmano. We're talking about shchita and kabbalah Allah chazrika. We're talking about different avodas. So just like over there in the Reisha, we're talking about different avodas. Here in the Sefer, we're also talking about different avodas. So the Gemara says that we prefer right now Ilfa's shita because it's consistent with the earlier part of the Mishnah. Where am I? So Bishlam the Ilfa, 2 lines to the bottom of the daf. So I understand Ilfa's shita midereisha b'shtei avodas. Since the earlier part of the Mishnah, which I just read, is talking about multiple avodas, sefer nami b'shtei avodas. So also in the sefer, when we talk about kzayis l'machar, kzayis b'chutz, for example, right? Chutz l'zmano, chutz l'mkomo, and Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, that would be Pigul. That's also multiple avodas. Avol Rabbi Yochanan reisha b'shtei avodas v'sefer b'avodah achas. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, are we saying that earlier in the Mishnah it's talking about 2 avodas, and now at the end of the Mishnah it's talking about avodah achas? In Taka, yes. Reisha b'shtei avodas, sefer ben b'avodah achas, ben b'shtei avodas. Yes, Taka, according to Rabbi Yochanan, we would say that earlier in the Mishnah, it's talking about multiple avodas, right? As it said, Shachat chutz lizmano, and then Kibal Zar Kalach, whatever, chutz limkomo. So yeah, we're talking about multiple avodas. But the Seifa is Taka talking about if you had machshava chutz lizmano, followed by chutz limkomo, all during the Shechita, for example. So Rabbi Yehuda would also argue there and say Tfos lashon rishon, there would be a chiyuv kares if the machshava chutz lizmano preceded. So again, in Reisha b'shtei avodas, yes, the first part, the earlier part of the Mishnah is talking about two avodas, seifa, but at the end, when we talk about machlokas Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda, bein b'avodah achas, bein b'shtei avodas, that is whether we are talking about both machshavas during one avodah or whether they were spread out in two avodas. Either way, Rabbi Yehuda would disagree. Tanan, we learn in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda, zeh klal, this is the rule. This is the general rule. This is the framework that we could apply to other cases as well. Im machshavas hazman kodmal machshavas hamokim, if the machshava of zman, of time, came before the machshava of place, Pigul, it's Pigul v'chayav and olive kares. And you be chayav kares. So if the chutz zmano came before, the machshavas chutz zmano preceded the machshavas chutz limkomo, so then it would be kares. So now, Bishlam, Rabbi Yochanan, so I understand according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Tanakama is not just by two avodas, but even by one avodah. This is why Rabbi Yehuda comes and says this is the general rule. What's a general rule? A general rule is something that could be applied in other scenarios as well. So what's the other scenarios? Well, until now we were talking about two avodas, but here's the rule: we can apply it even to one avodah. Elala ilfa ma'izeh klal kasha. But according to Ilfa, what's this general rule? According to Ilfa, the machlokas, it's the same machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and the Rabbanan in the Seifa as it is in the Reisha. So what do you need the general rule for? What other scenarios is it being applied to? Kasha, it's not a good question. According to Ilfa, where we're only talking about, the whole Mishnah is consistent in only talking about two separate avodas, and Rabbi Yehuda only disagrees with Tanakama when it's two separate avodas. So what's he talking about? This is the general rule. What other cases are we going to apply it to? I understand according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says, yeah, the other case we'll apply to is even avodah achas. So the Gemara says, the lashon of Rabbi Yehuda saying that zeh klal, this is the rule. If the chutz zmano came first, it's pigul chayav kares. According to Rabbi Yochanan, yeah, because he's saying it doesn't only apply to the shtei avodas that we're talking about until now. It even applies to avodah achas. And I think that I think that for the rest of the daf we could make that assumption like Rabbi Yochanan, that even by avodah achas, so if you slaughter again, it'll help us for just kind of working through the scenarios. We could talk about scenarios where simply a person slaughters a korban with the intention of eating one kzayis chutz lizmano and another kzayis chutz limkomo, for example. Givaldik. And now moving on to the next section of our Gemara, which is, it's not a great name. I don't really, obviously if I knew a better way to name it, I would have named it better, but Tfos lashon rishon, again, two thoughts for one avodah. Yeah, that's not really a great thing, because that's kind of like what it sounds very similar to what we were just talking about now, right? Two thoughts for one avodah, but it's more than that. It goes a little bit further. It's a very technical daf, but it goes a little bit further on that. And really, we're going to be viewing this. We're going to be viewing this concept through the perspective. I don't know what words I'm looking for, but we're going to be looking basically at a machlokes between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi. I know that this is really technically the next section that I have here on the chapters, which is Reb Meir versus Reb Yossi by temurah. But really, we're initially going to introduce the machlokas between Reb Yossi and Reb Meir when it comes to temurah, as a way of understanding the machlokas between Reb Yehuda and the Chachamim by Tfos lashon rishon. And then afterwards, we're actually going to look at the machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi on its own, which is why I divided them into two separate sections. But really, what's the main interest for us, of course, is the machlokas between Reb Yehuda and the Chachamim with regard to Tfos lashon rishon. Says the Gemara. Tananasim we learn in temurah. Arezo temuras ola Temurah shlomim. Okay, you can understand why this is related to Tfos lashon rishon. What's temurah? Who wants to explain temurah? Any volunteers? Mom, you want to volunteer? Mom, you want to tell us what temurah is? Your father, Zeta would. This was the kind of mesechta that Zeta would learn. Temurah. It's the kind of mesechta that Zeta would learn. You like to learn the off the beaten path mesechtas, like temurah, I think. Anyways, so temurah is when you have a korban, right? So let's say you say, okay, this sheep, Ruvain the sheep, I'm going to bring it as a korban olah. And then you see, I'm going to say Levi the sheep because that's going to be the names that we're going to be using now. So, and then you see Levi the sheep and you say, you know what? Instead, I actually want Levi the sheep to be my korban olah. You can't do that. That's what's called temurah. It's actually a lav. It's actually a lav. You're not allowed to do that. So, what happens then is Levi the sheep. Wait. The korban olah, the kedusha of the korban olah is not transferred from Reuven the sheep to Levi the sheep. Actually, what happens is both of them now have kedusha, and I think the point is that you probably offer both of them as korban olahs. I think is the point. Now, what happens in a scenario where a person says, "I'm going to bring a korban olah, and I'm also going to bring a korban shlamim." And he goes and he says, okay, Reuven the sheep, you're going to be a korban olah. Shimon the sheep, you're going to be a korban shlamim. And then he sees, there's Levi the sheep. And he says, you know what, Levi the sheep, you are a temurah for the korban olah instead of Reuven the sheep. And then what he says is, you're a temurah, you're a replacement for my korban shlamim, for Shimon the sheep. So now the question is it Eruv Machshavis? Is it that he has two intentions? He has an intention of Korban Shlamim and an intention of Korban Olah. In which case what you do is Yira Achi Yistayev, you give it to a shepherd, you say, hey, shepherd, I can't do anything with this Korban right now. I can't offer it as a Korban because it's a mixture of a Olah and a Shlamim. Shepherd, just take care of it for me. Let me know if it develops a blemish. And then once it develops a blemish, it can be sold, and that money would be taken to buy two animals. One would be offered as an Olah, the other as a Shlamim. That's what the halacha would be if we said Eruv Machshavis, that he said Olah and Shlamim. And therefore we kind of mix both kavanas together. We say, okay, Yirachi Yistai. But if we say Tfos lashon rishon, well, he had initially said that it's a temurah for the olah. So that's what it is. It's temurah's olah, and it would be offered as a korban olah. You wouldn't have to do, right? It wouldn't be a combination. And you wouldn't have to let it graze and the whole mum thing and everything like that. So, again, so Tanan Asam, we learn in the Mishnah in Masechta Temurah, Arei Zo, Temurah's Olah, Temurah Shlamim. Right? So if a person had set aside Ruvain the sheep to be a korban olah and Shimon the sheep to be a korban shlamim, and then he sees Levi the sheep and he says, this is a temurah for my korban olah, i.e. Ruvain the sheep. This is a korban temurah for my shlamim, i.e. Shimon the sheep. Arezo temuras olah divrei Meir. So Meir says it's temuras olah. Essentially, it sounds like, so it's going to be a machlokes later on about, is Reb Meir saying like Reb Yehuda, Tfos lashon rishon? Let's assume for now, yes, he is. So Reb Meir is saying, let's assume for now that this is what's going on, and let's operate with that assumption. So Reb Meir is saying Tfos lashon rishon, that you go based on the first thing that he said, which is that Levi the sheep is a replacement for Ruvain the sheep, the olah, and therefore Levi the sheep is temuras olah. That's the first thing that he said. Tfos lashon rishon. That's Reb Meir's shita. Reb Yossi says, Reb Yossi, im lechach niskaben tchila. Look, if initially he had a jumbled machshava, that Levi should be both a temurah for Ruvain as well as for Shimon, for the olah as well as the shlamim, since he's not like the Rabbeinu Shalom, he can't say two things at once, and therefore he said Harezet Temuras Olah followed by Harezet Temuras Shlamim, but really if he could, he would have said them both tzazamen at the same time. Well then, Dvar of Kayamin. Well then it's right. Yiracha Yistayiv Kilu. Okay. The temurahs ola and temurah shlam apply to it, and you have to let it graze till it gets a mum. Take the money that you sell it. Take the money, and then half goes to ola, half goes to shlam, etc. V'im misha omar arezo temurahs ola nimloch. But if what happened was, if he had initially said, Levi the sheep is going to be a replacement for my korban ola, Ruvain the sheep, and then he changed his mind and said, actually, you know what? It's going to be a replacement for Shimon the sheep, the shlomim. Well, in that case, no. The first one is what you're going to go with. Then in that case, if he changed his mind, you can't change your mind. And therefore, in that case, if it was clear that initially it was temurahs ola, it is going to be temurahs ola. Okay. Now, and this is really the nekuda that we're going to be working on here. Ibayu de asakasha. Harezo temurahs ola vishlamim mau lechatzos mau. Okay, those were two separate possibilities. What if he says not harezo temurahs ola temurahs shlamim? What if he says harezo temurahs ola vishlamim? Right, just like we're trying to figure out with Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim in our Mishnah by Tfos lashon rishon, right? Would Rabbi Yehuda only say Tfos lashon rishon by two separate avodas? What about by one avodah? Would he agree that that's eruv machshavas? So now we're asking a similar question in the machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. We're assuming that Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Yehuda, Tfos lashon rishon. So what if instead of saying harezo temurahs ola temurahs shlamim, he simply said harezo temurahs ola vishlamim? Would Rabbi Meir agree there that it would be eruv machshavas? Since he says harezo temurahs ola vishlamim, maybe it's one dibur, and we wouldn't say Tfos lashon rishon. And even if you want to say, okay, over there he does say Tfos lashon rishon. And if you want to say, when he says, harezo temurahs ola vishlamim, Rabbi Meir would still say it's an ola. Tfos lashon rishon. But what if he says that half of Levi the sheep is temurahs ola, meaning that half of the sheep is going to be an ola, and half of the sheep is going to be a shlamim? So do we say, okay, in that case, this one sheep, Levi the sheep, is being, the owner is saying that it should be an ola, this one sheep should be an ola and a shlamim, right? Not an ola followed by a shlamim. He's not replacing it. He's saying half of it should be an ola, half of it should be a shlamim. So do we say, okay, in that case it's eruv machshavas, and therefore you let it graze? Or would Reb Meir still say that, no, once half of it is the ola, the whole thing is the ola, and it would be a temurahs ola? So again, we're trying to figure out to what extent do we say Tfos lashon rishon, right? When the owner says that half of Levi the sheep is temurahs ola, and therefore the other half would be temurahs shlamim, would Reb Meir, who we're assuming says Tfos lashon rishon, like Rabbi Yehuda, would he still say there Tfos lashon rishon, or by then, in that scenario at least, he would agree eruv machshava? So again, building on the theme that we've been building in since the beginning of the Gemara of, how far are the Tfos lashon rishon people going to go and continue saying Tfos lashon rishon rather than, okay, fine, I agree, in this case it's eruv machshavas. So again, Ibayu de asakasha, harezo temurahs ola vishlamim. If instead of saying harezo temurahs ola temurah shlamim, he says harezo temurahs ola vishlamim, mau. So in that case, would Reb Meir say eruv machshavas? Lechatzis mau. Or what if he says half of Levi the sheep is temurahs ola? In that case, when he's talking about, he's pretty explicit that half of the animals are ola and half of the other half is going to be a shlamim. Maybe there he would say that we wouldn't say Tfos lashon rishon, and actually half of it would be an ola and half of it would be a shlamim, and you'd have to let it graze. Omer Abaye says Abaye. Now we're going to say Machlokas Abaye and Rava. It says Abaye Beha Vade Moder Meir. Oh, okay. Rava. So Abaye says, okay, we have reached the limits of Tfos lashon rishon. Abaye says we have reached the limits of Tfos lashon rishon. Here, when it comes to L'chatzayid, that when he says that this one sheep, and this is what I called it, right? Tfos lashon rishon, two thoughts on one avodah. We're going to tie it into shchita now, but kilu, in this case, when it comes to the sheep, right, is there's one sheep. We're making it clear that we're trying to stuff in two machshavas here of temurahs ola and temurahs shlamim. Abaye says, okay, over here we have reached the limits of Tfos lashon rishon. Over here, Reb Meir is going to say, we're not going to say Tfos lashon rishon here. Rather, it's going to be erev machshavas, and you're going to let it graze until it gets a mum, etc. Whereas Rava Omar says, Rava adayini machlokas. Rava says, even here, Reb Meir would say Tfos lashon rishon. Amar le Rava Abaye, and Rava says to Abaye, I'll prove it to you from our Mishnah. The didach to Omar b'avade mother of Meir, because according to you, Abaye, that you say that in this case, when you're talking about half of Levi the sheep, Reb Meir would admit that, okay, here I'll say erev machshavas, I'm not going to say Tfos lashon rishon here. But our shchita, what about our Mishnah that talks about shchita? The chi lachtzos dami uflige. Right, because in our Mishnah, the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon, where Rabbi Yehuda had said Tfos lashon rishon. So if we assume, like Rabbi Yochanan, that we're talking about one avodah, a shchita, so we're talking about one avodah here, just like we were talking about one sheep, and we're saying half of the sheep, right? Half of the sheep should be temurah shlam, half of it should be temurah shlamim. Here you have shchita, which is one avodah, and as you're slicing the neck, you say, I'm intending to eat a kzayis chutz lizmano, a kzayis chutz limkomo. You have two machshavas, and still, right, two machshavas for one avodah, and still, Rabbi Yehuda argues Tfos lashon rishon. So here also, Rava argues against Abaye that you have this sheep, and he's saying half of it should be temurah ola, half of it should be temurah shlam. Still, we're going to say Tfos lashon rishon, and just like half of it's temurah ola, the whole thing is temurah ola. Right? So just like Rabbi Yehuda who says Tfos lashon rishon, by shchita, when you have two kavanas, you go with the first one. Two machshavas, you go with the first one. So we'll say the same thing by the sheep. That when you have one sheep, and you have two machshavas, right, temurah ola and temurah shlamim, you're going to go with the first one, and it's going to be temurah ola. Omar lei, but Abaye disagrees with Rava. Misavat eina l'shchita ela livasov, yeshna l'shchita mitchila ve'ad sof. So says Abaye to Rava, wait a second. You're bringing a kasha against me from shchita. Well, by shchita, there's a big machlokas by shchita, says Abaye. There's a big question by shchita. How do we view shchita? Is shchita only at the very end? Once you've completed the shchita, that's when the shchita kicks in? Or do we say that shchita is a process from the beginning of the slice till the end of the slice? Let's go weiter. What's happening in our Mishnah is actually simin rishon chutz lizmano v'simin sheni chutz limkomo. And actually, says Abaye, what's happening in our Mishnah, when Rabbi Yehuda argues that by shchita you can have kavana chutz lizmano followed by kavana of chutz limkomo, argues Abaye, It's because yeshna l'shchita mitchila v'ad sof. Shchita it's not just considered shchita at the end of the shchita, but rather it's considered shchita throughout the slice, and therefore you could actually divide the slice into the trachea and the esophagus, and you can have one kavana when slicing the trachea, another kavana when slicing the esophagus. So therefore Abaye says, look, there is a limit to Tfos lashon rishon. And we experienced that limit when it came to Levi the sheep. That when that when the owner said Levi the sheep is temuras ola, temuras shlam, right, half of it's temuras ola, half of it's temuras shlamim. Over there it's eruv machshavos. We're not going to say Tfos lashon rishon. However, says Abaye, our Mishnah is not that. Yes, there's a kavanah of chutz lizmano and chutz l'mkomo by shchita, but shchita is yeshna l'shchita mitchila va'ad sof. Right, shchita isn't just at the end, but it's throughout the slice, and you could divide this slice into the trachea and the esophagus, and you can have machshav of chutz lizmano by the trachea, and a machshav of chutz lizmano l'mkomo by the esophagus, and you can have two separate machshavas of chutz lizmano and chutz l'mkomo. We could say Tfos lashon rishon, and Rabbi Yehuda would say Tfos lashon rishon there, because you're still talking about two separate things. Right, the slicing of the esophagus, the slicing of the trachea. But there is a limit, argues Abaye, that, for example, when it comes to Levi the sheep, when half of it is temuras ola and half of it's temuras shlamim, then we're talking about one sheep that has temuras ola and temuras shlamim. That's going to be eruv machshavas, and we're not going to say Tfos lashon rishon. We're not going to say it's only temuras ola. Rather, we're going to say let it graze until it gets a mum, and then bring both an ola and a shlamim. But Rava's not done yet. He's not done, right? Rava's arguing against Abaye, and he's saying, no. Tfos lashon rishon goes ad asof. That even by half of the sheep, we're still going to say it's temuras ola. We're still going to say Tfos lashon rishon. Hare kmitza. Because what about kmitza? Lachzos dami uflige, that there is a machlokes when it comes to kmitza. Kmitza is, when it comes to a korban mincha, so korban mincha is a flour offering. And what you do is you take a fistful of the flour offering and you burn that on the mizbeach. So by shchita, Abaye said you could divide shchita into the trachea and esophagus. A kmitza, taking a fistful of flour, how are you going to divide that up into separate things that you could say this one's chutz lizmano and this one's chutz lizmkomo, and yet we have the same machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim by kmitza, that if when taking the kometz, he has kavanah of chutz lizmano followed by chutz l'mkomo, Rabbi Yehuda would say Tfos lashon rishon, and that it would be considered chutz lizmano and there would be a chiyuv kares, even though it's just one action. Right? It's like the sheep. Right? It's like the sheep that you're saying half of it's temuras ola, half of it's temuras shlamim. And here you have this one kmitza. We're saying you have the kavanah of both chutz lizmano and chutz l'mkomo. And says Rava, Rabbi Yehuda still argues there and says Tfos lashon rishon. And therefore argues Rava that Tfos lashon rishon would also apply to Levi the sheep, even when you say half of it. So Asam Nami, no, Abaye responds there also, actually, it can be divided into separate parts. Domer kometz mincha chutz lizmano koret levona chutz l'mkomo. That even though by the kmitza, by taking the kometz, the fistful, there's just one fistful, but when it comes to burning the mincha, you burn the kometz, but you also burn frankincense along with it. Not with all korbanos, as we're going to see in a second. Minchas choti doesn't have frankincense, but not by all menachos, but by, I think, most menachos, maybe all of them, other menachos, I don't remember exactly, but there are menachos at least that I think most menachos you would bring you would burn both the flour, the fistful of flour, as well as frankincense. So there actually it can be divided up into the flour and the frankincense when it comes to burning the korban mincha. And you could say also, right, so Abaye would say that that's talking about where there was a kavanah of chutz lizmano by the burning of the kometz of the flour in chutz l'machshavas chutz l'mkomo when it came to burning the frankincense. But when it comes to Levi the sheep, lachatzos, for half of it, Abaye still would argue that we're talking about that it would be eruv machshavas, that we've reached the limit of Tfos lashon rishon. So again, Asam Nami there also the Omar kometz mincha chutz lizmano, that when he burnt the kometz of the mincha, he had a kavanah of chutz lizmano, koret levana chutz limkoma, but when he burnt the frankincense, he had a kavana of chutz limkoma. Re kometz de minchas chote, de leka levona baide uflige. Yeah, well, what about the kometz of a minchas chote? Minchas chote, there's no levona, there's no frankincense by a sinner's korban mincha. And their machlokas applies there as well. The machlokas of Yehuda and the Rabbanon about Tfos lashon rishon when it comes to chutz zman and chutz limkomo. Lo plige. Abai says actually they don't argue by minchas chote. Actually, they argue by other menachos, but not by minchas chote. Rav Ashi says, Rav Ashi timtzilomar plige bipsias, and says Rav Ashi, even if you want to say that they do argue by a minchas chote, you could say yeah, but still you could talk about when you walk the minchas chote up the mizbeach to burn it. So yes, you're only talking about burning the kmitza, the kometz, but you're going to be taking step. You're going to be walking up to the top of the mizbeach to burn it, and you could say you take one step by holacha. You have one step chutz l'zman, or another step chutz l'mkomo. So again, Abaye says that even by a minchas chote, you could find ways to sort of break it down into different parts that you can have different kavanas but continues to argue Abaye when it comes to Levi the sheep, that he says half of Levi the sheep is going to be temuras ola and half is going to be temuras shlamim. Abaye would say that you have reached the limits of Tfos lashon rishon, and the sheep would have both. Right? What would be eruv machshavas, and we would not say Tfos lashon rishon there, and you would wait for it to graze and get a mum, etc. Rav Shimon bar Ashi masni ka Abaye, Rav Huna bar Noson masni kiderove. Rav Shimon bar Ashi teaches like Abaye that there is a limit to Tfos lashon rishon, whereas Rav Huna bar Noson teaches like Rave that we would even say Tfos lashon rishon, even in these scenarios that like Levi the sheep, where you're talking about one sheep that you're having both the kavana of temuras ola and temuras shlamim, and we could say Rava says still if you say Tfos lashon rishon, you would say Tfos lashon rishon there as well. So now we get to a machloikes about how exactly to understand the machloikes between. Well, a machloikes about how to understand the machloikes between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi, but let's say in a way that's a little bit more or less confusing, as if that's going to be less confusing. A little bit more or less confusing. Akoponim. Up until now, we've been saying that Reb Meir is aligned with Reb Yehuda, i.e., Reb Meir says Tfos lashon rishon, right? So when we saw the sheet of Reb Meir, that when he says Areza temuras ola temuras shlamim, Reb Meir says Areza ola because Tfos lashon rishon, just like Reb Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon. Now we're going to see a machlokes about is that in fact Reb Meir's the context behind Reb Meir's shita. Does he in fact hold like Reb Yehuda of Tfos lashon rishon, or maybe not? It's going to be a machlokes. Kazer Rav Dimi Amr Meir b'shittas Reb Yehuda Amr. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babble, he said that Reb Meir is in cahoots with Reb Yehuda. I think that means that he's aligned with Reb Yehuda, i.e., the Amr Tfos lashon rishon. That Reb Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, Reb Meir says the same. Which is why Reb Meir said Areza temuras ola, because Tfos lashon rishon we go based on. He said temuras ola, temuras shlamim. It's a temuras ola, Tfos lashon rishon. And now, how do we know that Reb Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon as well? That's not that we learned in our Mishnah. Reb Yehuda says Reb Yehuda zeh klal. This is the rule. In machshavas azman kadma es machshavas hamakim pigul v'chayven olav kares. That Reb Yehuda had said in our Mishnah that if chutz lizmano precedes chutz limkomo, well then it's going to be pigul, and there's going to be a chiyuv kares because Tfos lashon rishon. So Reb Meir, who says Areza temuras ola, is aligned with Reb Yehuda, who says Pigul v'chayven olav kares, because both agree that Tfos lashon rishon to go based on the first thing that you said. In the case of Reb Meir, it's temuras ola. In the case of Reb Yehuda, it's chutz lizman. Omer le Abaye, but Abaye disagrees. Abaye says to Rav Dimi, "Va'omer Abba bar Bachana Reb Yechanan," says Abba Bachana in the name of Reb Yechanan, "Ki magas lehu Reb Meir Reb Yossi b'adei adadi lo plige." That says Abaye, I disagree. Abai says to Redimi, you're telling me, you're arguing that Reb Meir is aligned with Reb Yehuda, Tfos lashon rishon. Says Abaye that I'll bring you proof from Rabbi Chana and Reb Yechanan that Reb Meir disagrees with Reb Yehuda. That actually, if you look a little bit deeper, if you scratch beneath the surface, Reb Meir is actually fairly aligned with Reb Yossi, actually, and they both disagree with Reb Yehuda. Reb Meir says, like Reb Yossi, no Tfos lashon rishon. Reb Meir does not hold of Tfos lashon rishon. Does not hold like Reb Yehuda. Does not hold of Tfos lashon rishon. And the machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi is simply about what did this owner of the korban have of these korbanis, the shlomim, the olah, what did he have in mind when he said, "Arizah temuras olah, temuras shlomim," etc. So again, the Reb Meir does not hold the Tfos lashon rishon. He's just trying to get in the mindset of what the person was thinking. What did he have in mind? Let's see. So again, Reb Meir, Reb Yossi, ba de adad lo plige. They actually don't argue. V'lo pliga. What do you mean they don't argue? Mipalik pliga. What do you mean they don't argue? We saw machlokas between Meir and Yossi. Of course they argue. The thing is, they're actually closer than you think. Omar lei, Abai responds to Rav Dimi, b'may de plige b'may de plige, v'lo plige b'may de lo plige. Look, they argue with what they argue about, but they don't argue with what they don't argue about. That's nice. But the point is like, they actually agree more than they disagree is the point. They disagree really only in a small scenario. The Amr Yitzchak bar Yosef, Amr Yechanan, Hakol Modim, everybody agrees, i.e. Reb Meir and Reb Yossi agree. Heicha de Amr Tachol Zo v'achar kach Tachol Zo Divrei Hakol lo chayla. They both agree that if the owner said Levi the sheep should be a temurah shlomim, and then he says afterwards that I want it to be a temurah. I'm sorry, if he first said it should be a temuras olah, and then he says it should be a temuras shlomim, everyone agrees. Reb Meir would also agree, Reb Yossi would also agree that it's temuras olah, because you can't have a kedusha chalal kedusha. Once already intentionally made Levi the sheep temuras olah, Reb Meir and Reb Yossi agree, he can't now make it temuras shlomim, it's going to be temuras olah. Even Reb Yossi would agree with that. Lo tachalzo ela im kein chalazo, and if he says that it's only going to be a temuras olah if it is a temuras shlomim. Like when it becomes a temuras shlomim at the tzazamen at the same time, it becomes a temuras olah. Well, if that's the case, clearly his intention was that it should be both. Everyone agrees that it's going to be both. It's going to be erev machshavos. It's going to be both. And it'll be yirat she'istayv. Ki plige, where they argue, where there's a machlokes between Reb Yossi and Reb Meir, is getting into the mindset in the following case: the Amar temuras olah, temuras shlomim. It was specifically in the case that we mentioned the machlokas between them. It's specifically in that case of temuras olah, Reza temuras olah, temuras shlomim. What exactly is his kavanah? We're just trying to figure out what's he really trying to say. Reb Meir holds, if the intention was to say that it's both, well then he would say temuras olam vish oval of vishlamim. Temuras olah temuras shlamim shmamina mahader ko adarbe. But he said this is temuras olah, and then he says it's temuras shlamim. He's replacing his initial thing that he said. He initially said olah, and now he's replacing it with shlamim. He's not saying it's both. If he was saying it's both, he would say Arizah temuras olah vishlamim, but he doesn't say that. He's replacing the original statement of Arizah temuras olah, and he's saying, you know what, actually temuras shlamim, and you can't do that. Therefore, that's why it's temuras olah. It's not because it's Tfos lashon rishon. It's because he was doing something that you can't do. He was trying to replace the initial kedusha with a different kedusha. You can't do that. Reb Yossi disagrees with Reb Meir only with Reb Meir's approach, because Reb Yossi says no. Reb Yossi says to Reb Meir, look, Reb Meir, you're suggesting that if he wanted to say that it should be both, he should have said Arizah temuras olah vishlamim. Reb Yossi says that would never work. Temuras olah vishlamim. If he said that temuras olah vishlamim, hava amina palga temuras olah ufalga temuras shlamim. I would have, right, the implication of that is that half of the animal, half of Levi the sheep should be temurah olah, half of it should be temurah shlom, but you can't make a half korban and therefore you wouldn't be able to offer it. So you can't say, how is it temurah olah v'shlam? So he had to say, L'achi amar temurah olah, temurah shlamim, l'meimu dechula olah v'chula shlamim havya. To say that he wants the entire animal to be temurah olah and also temurah shlamim, and therefore he's saying both. So by saying temurah olah, temurah shlamim, he's saying I want it to be both. And it can't be offered as both. So therefore you have to let it graze until it gets a mum. So according to Abaye, both Reb Meir and Reb Yossi disagree with Tfos lashon rishon. They're simply arguing about what exactly was his kavanah. Did he intend for it to be both an olah and a shlamim? Or did he originally say it should be an olah followed by a shlamim, which you can't do? That's it, but nothing to do with Tfos lashon rishon. So Rav Dimi responds to Abai, because Rav Dimi had said that Reb Meir holds like Reb Yehuda, Tfos lashon rishon. So Rav Dimi says to Abai, look, Amar le, hu Amar lo pligi. Look, Rabbi Bar Chana said they don't argue. That Reb Meir and Reb Yossi be'etzem agree, they just disagree on some small technicality. But I, Rav Dimi, disagree with Rabbi Bar Chana. Rav Dimi was pretty early. Rav Dimi, I think he was pretty early. It's funny, Rav Dimi, right, he interacts with Abaye, who was already, a fourth generation Amora, but I think he's also, I do think he's, he often is relaying messages, I think, from Rabbi Yochanan. So I don't know, he must have somewhere straddled some generations, but anyways, says Rav Dimi, look, Rabbi Bar Chana says one thing, but I disagree with Rabbi Bar Chana, and I say that my view is that Reb Meir agrees with Rabbi Yehuda of Tfos lashon rishon. Okay, we are now up to the final section of today's daf, so hopefully I should be able to get it in before Shabbos. It's been now 3:48 p.m. When did I start? Wow, it's been over an hour already. So hopefully I should be able to get this stuff in. I'll definitely be able to get this stuff in before Shabbos. The question is if I'll have to hustle at the end. I don't know. Yeah, this is this next part of the Gemara. So this is Tfos lashon rishon. So we already had Tfos lashon rishon, one avodah versus two avodahs. We also had Tfos lashon rishon, two thoughts for one avodah, which was like two thoughts for like Levi the sheep or Shchita, whatever. Now Tfos lashon rishon, two thoughts for one kzayis. This is going to be an interesting question, and it's going to be a little bit subtle. So we're gonna have to. It's the last section of the daf, but we're gonna have to work through it. Okay. Amrullah says Zula v'temurah v'oshaya. Efshir yadin chavin bavloya. Kzayis tnan. Oh, kzayis v'chazayis tnan. Okay, doki. So says Ula. Some say Rabbi Oshaya. Maybe our friends in Babylon know the answer to the following question. What's the following question? The following question is, when Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon in our Mishnah, what does he say in our Mishnah? He says, Lechol kzayis macher. What is it? What does he say in our Mishnah? Lechol kzayis bachutz, kzayis l'macher, kzayis macher, kzayis bachutz. So when Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon by kzayis l'macher, kzayis bachutz, when he says kzayis l'macher, kzayis l'chutz, so if a person is slaughtering a korban and he has the machshava of lechol kzayis l'macher, to eat a kzayis of its meat tomorrow, as well as a kzayis of its meat bachutz. So l'macher is chutz l'zmano, bachutz is chutz l'mkomo. So Ula wants to know, is it kzayis bachutz? No, is it kzayis l'macher, kzayis bachutz? Or is it kzayis l'macher v'kzayis bachutz? What's the difference? Well, the difference is kzayis l'macher v'kzayis bachutz is one statement. Kzayis l'macher v'kzayis bachutz. He's saying, right, he's slaughtering a korban with the intention, with the machshava of eating kzayis l'macher v'kzayis bachutz, one statement. Whereas kzayis l'macher, kzayis bachutz, Two separate statements, right? There's no vav to bring it all together. So therefore, getting back to our question of what is the extent of Tfos lashon rishon. So if you say that the Mishnah is dafka saying that Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon by kzayis lemachar, kzayis bachutz, when it's two separate statements, but maybe if it's kzayis lemachar vikazayis bachutz, where it's one statement linked together by the vav, maybe he would say eruv machshavos over here. So therefore, we need to know, is it kzayis or kzayis vikazayis? So again, Amr Ula v'Temurah b'Shaya Efshir Yadin Chavin Bavloya. Maybe our friend the Babylonian, I don't know who that is. Maybe he knows kzayis. Kzayis tanan, is it kzayis or kzayis v'chazayis tanan? Or is it kzayis v'chazayis? Is it kzayis tanan that when it's two separate statements, that's where Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, aval kzayis v'chazayis, where it's one statement, tivakol eruv machshavis havei. Everyone agrees that would be eruv machshavis. And Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't say Tfos lashon rishon over there. O Dilma, or perhaps kzayis v'chazayis tanan. Or maybe it's kzayis v'chazayis. Did Rabbi Yehuda parta of it? Rabbi Yehuda says even kzayis v'chazayis, one statement, Rabbi Yehuda would say you could break it up and say Tfos lashon rishon v'chol sheken, and then certainly kzayis, right? When it's one statement, meaning if kzayis v'chazayis, when it's one statement, Rabbi Yehuda will say you could treat it as, you could break it up and say Tfos lashon rishon. So certainly kzayis, which is milichatchila, the two statements, you can say Tfos lashon rishon. So Tashma coming here. Deba mine Levi me Rabbi, that Levi asked Rabbi the following question. Chishev lechol kzayis lemachar bachutz mahu. So now we see a third scenario, which is even more limited, I guess you could say, maybe. Lechol kzayis lemachar bachutz. It's clear that it's talking about this one zayis. Meaning the other options we had was kzayis v'chazayis. This is kzayis lemachar bachutz. This one zayis, I'm going to eat it tomorrow outside of, let's say, the azar, if it's kachik. So what would be the scenario there? Because in that case, even if you say that, sure, Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon by kzayis v'chazayis, by one statement, what would he say about kzayis lemachar bachutz? Maybe that's reached his limit. Maybe there he would say eruv machshavis. So this is what Levi asks Rabbi. So again, Tashma deba mine Levi asks Rabbi, Chishev lechol kzayis lemachar bachutz. What if a person, let's say, slaughters a korban with the intention of eating a kzayis tomorrow outside? Chutz lizmanu, chutz limkomo, for the one kzayis. Ma, what's the halacha? Omle zo sheila. Rabbi says, ooh, what a question. Rabbi says to Levi, gewaldige kasha. Eruv machshavos have. The answer is, we've reached the limits of Tfos lashon rishon. Rabbi Yehuda would say, eruv machshavos. He would say, kzayis lemachar bachutz, eruv machshavos. He would not say Tfos lashon rishon. He would not say there's a chiyuv kars. Amal the fun of Reb Shimon. So now, Reb Shimon, Amal the fun of Reb Shimon Berebi. Now, Rebbe's son Reb Shimon Berebi says to Rebbe, wait, why? I don't understand. Why are you getting so excited about Levi's question? It's not really a great question. Lo Mishnah Seidui. Can we just look at our Mishnah? Lechol kzayis bachutz, kzayis lemachar. If he slaughters a korban with the intention of kzayis bachutz, kzayis lemachar, or kzayis lemachar, kzayis bachutz, kachatzi zayis bachutz, kachatzi zayis lemachar, kachatzi zayis lemachar, kachatzi zayis bachutz. Pasul ve'imbo karis. In any of those scenarios, we say pasul ve'imbo karis. And there, Rabbi Yehuda argues. And he says, Tfos lashon rishon. He says that by kzayis lemachar, kzayis bachutz, there Rabbi Yehuda says, Tfos lashon rishon and b'chiyuv karis. Ha'idach, but if we're talking about a different scenario, like kzayis lemachar bachutz, eruv machshavos have. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue there. And he would say Erev Machshava. So Levi asks Rebbe about kzayis l'macha b'chutz. Rebbe says, oh, now that is a gavaldi kasha, a kasha from Kasha land. I had kasha today, not kasha. I had kasha varnishkis today. My mom says she made kasha varnishkis. Any kasha varnishkis fans at Babble on Talmud? So Rebbe says, wow, best kasha ever. And he answers, okay, it would be Erev Machshavas there. Reb Shimon Rebbe says, I don't understand why it's the best kasha ever. Our Mishnah tells us where Reb Yehuda disagrees. It's kzayis l'macher, kzayis b'chutz, but kzayis b'chutz l'macher, kzayis l'macher b'chutz would be Erev Machshavas. So Omar lei, so Rebbe responds, look. Here's the thing. There's more context. Rebbe says, look, Reb Shimon, his son Shimon, right? He says to his son Shimon, to you, from your perspective, from where you're coming from, you're right. Levi's question isn't such a good question. However, there's more context that I need to make you aware of. Omar lei, Rebbe says to Shimon, his son, to Reb Shimon Rebbe, his son, Hu sha'al bi dvar chochma v'at omrat mishnasenu. Rebbe says to his son, Levi over here asked me a gavaldic question, and you're just blowing it off and saying, it's our Mishnah. Listen. L'didach das nisoch tarte loy kashelach. Rebbe says to his son Shimon, he says, look, when I taught you the Mishnah, so I taught you tarte. What does tarte mean? It means that I taught you that Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon and argues with the Chachamim in two scenarios. Kzayis, and kzayis v'kzayis. I deliberately left out kzayis l'macher b'chutz because Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say Tfos lashon rishon there. So you, right, I taught you the Mishnah in such a way that you can now say simply, well, Rabbi Yehuda only argues by kzayis, and kzayis v'kzayis. Kzayis l'macher b'chutz would be Erev Machshavas. However, L'didei b'ta Levi, Dilo as nisei elachada, the thing is, when I taught Levi the Mishnah, I only taught him kzayis, that's it. When I taught Levi the Mishnah, I only taught him kzayis. Which means all he knows is that when he says kzayis l'macher, kzayis b'chutz, Rabbi Yehuda argues. He doesn't know what Rabbi Yehuda would say by kzayis v'chazayis. Maybe there he would say Erev Machshavas. And if he says Erev Machshavas over there, then certainly Rabbi Yehuda would say Erev Machshavas by kzayis l'macher b'chutz. The thing is, here's the thing though. V'sham'inu l'Rabbanan, but then Levi heard the rabbis dikar say tarte, but then he heard from me kzayis, but then he heard the rabbis saying not just kzayis, like in the Beis HaMedrash. He heard that they were saying not just kzayis. He also heard them saying kzayis v'kzayis. Rabbi Yehuda would say Tfos lashon rishon, and now Levi is wondering. Now he's trying to figure this out. And now he's trying to figure out who's got it right. Do I have it right that it's only kzayis? Or do they have it right that it's kzayis v'kzayis? Didi davka, do I have it right? Kzayis? V'didu eruv machshavas have? But according to them, that they're saying that not only kzayis, but also Rabbi Yehuda argues and says Tfos lashon rishon also by kzayis v'kzayis, but they're adding that on their own. That's not the real one, right? Again, is it Didi Davka? Do I have the real, authentic version that I was taught by Rebbe? Kzayis. And the rabbis were saying not just kzayis, but also kzayis v'kzayis. Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon. That's not the authentic version. They're adding that on their own. But the fact of the matter is, Eruv Machshavas Havik. The fact of the matter is, I have the authentic version from Rebbe. And it's kzayis, but kzayis v'chazayis, Rabbi Yehuda would agree, Eruv Machshavas Havik, or Dima, or perhaps, Didu Davka. Maybe they have the correct, maybe they have the authentic version. V'ledidi, and my version is incomplete. Shayure Shayerli. And my version of simply kzayis is incomplete, and Rebbe left out kzayis v'chazayis, and the rabbis in the Beis HaMedrash have the correct version of kzayis v'chazayis that Rabbi Yehuda agrees. That Rabbi Yehuda would argue and say Tfos lashon rishon by kzayis v'chazayis umidashayir li ledidi, and now Levi's confused and he has all sorts of questions because he's wondering, well, I was told kzayis, and maybe that's actually not accurate. Maybe it's kzayis v'chazayis, and you know what? Maybe they were told kzayis v'chazayis, and maybe theirs is also not accurate, and maybe it even applies to kzayis l'machar b'chutz. And maybe Rabbi Yehuda also even says Tfos lashon rishon there too. I don't even know what's right anymore, says Levi, because I was just told kzayis. I don't know, am I right? Kzayis. Are the rabbis right? Kzayis v'chazayis. In which case, if it's kzayis v'chazayis also, then why was I not told about it? And if I wasn't told about kzayis v'chazayis, maybe they weren't told about kzayis l'machar b'chutz. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda says, Tfos lashon rishon by all the cases. I simply have no clue. And Rebbe is explaining this to his son Shimon, that this is why Levi is asking a great question. Right? Rebbe is explaining to his son Shimon that this is why Levi is asking a great question. So midashayir li ledivdi, and just like, right, so Levi's wondering, just like Rebbe told me kzayis, and he left out kzayis v'chazayis, hashayir lehu ledidu nami behach. And maybe their version is also, the rabbi's version in the Beis HaMedrash is also lacking, and maybe Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon even by kzayis b'chutz l'machar. I'm sorry, kzayis l'machar b'chutz. So v'heyes naye nu. So what is the right? What is the right version? Ilema kzayis v'chazayis asnaye. What's the gimel? The gimel is important. Dil Rabbi Yehuda partave kolshken kzayis. So if Levi was taught by Rebbe kzayis v'chazayis, right? So if Levi was taught by Rebbe kzayis v'chazayis, and Rabbi Yehuda argues there and says Tfos lashon rishon. So kzayis v'chazayis, where it's one statement, kzayis v'chazayis, and Rabbi Yehuda argues Tfos lashon rishon. So then certainly by kzayis, Rabbi Yehuda would also argue and say Tfos lashon rishon. Well, if that's the case, then Levi wouldn't have anything to ask Rebbe. Kilu, if Rebbe had taught Levi that by kzayis v'chazayis, Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, well then certainly by kzayis, Rabbi Yehuda would argue, where it's two separate statements, he would argue Tfos lashon rishon. And from the fact that Rebbe only taught kzayis v'chazayis and didn't teach kzayis l'machar b'chutz, clearly means that case would be eruv machshavas. Right? If essentially Rebbe was teaching him that both by kzayis v'chazayis, and then that means that obviously kzayis, Tfos lashon rishon, and is specifically leaving out kzayis l'machar b'chutz. So clearly Levi would know that kzayis l'machar b'chutz is eruv machshavas. So he wouldn't have to ask Levi. He wouldn't have to ask Rebbe. Ele kzayis asnaye. Okay, so rather it must be that Rebbe taught Levi kzayis, and now Levi's trying to figure out. So now what? What is really the halacha? Right? Does Rabbi Yehuda argue and say Tfos lashon rishon by kzayis v'chazayis? Does he say, and what does he say by kzayis l'machar b'chutz? Okay, but tibayle kzayis v'chazayis. So if Rebbe only taught Levi kzayis, well then why is Levi going all the way to the extreme and saying and asking about kzayis l'machar b'chutz? Why not ask about kzayis v'chazayis? If Rebbe only taught him kzayis, that's where Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, and Levi doesn't know what the halacha would even be by kzayis v'chazayis. Maybe there already Rabbi Yehuda would say eruv machshavas. So then why is he asking Rebbe about kzayis l'macha b'chutz? He should ask him about kzayis v'chazayis. He doesn't know the answer to that either. Well, because ibai mine chada the shamayna tarte. Because look, Levi was asking Rebbe a question. He would prefer to ask one question that he can get all the information that he needs, rather than to have to ask Rebbe one question and then a follow-up question. Meaning, because the ba'ina kzayis v'chazayis, because Levi figured, look, if I ask Rebbe kzayis v'chazayis, well, hanicha yi'amar li klala. Well, that would all be fine and good if I ask Rebbe, what about kzayis v'kzayis? And Rebbe says, there, Rabbi Yehuda would say, eruv machshavis. Well, if by kzayis v'kzayis it's already eruv machshavis, so then certainly by kzayis l'macha b'chutz it would be eruv machshavis. However, Eli Omali Parta, but if Rebbe would answer, by kzayis v'chazayis, Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, but then I would now have to ask a follow-up question about what about kzayis l'macha b'chutz? Would he also say Tfos lashon rishon there? So akati kzayis l'macha b'chutz kami boyeli. I would still have to ask him about that. That would Rabbi Yehuda say Tfos lashon rishon there? Okay, bi'achi ashtanami. Okay, but still you can ask the same question about kzayis l'macha b'chutz. Hotenachi omar le kzayis l'macha b'chutz parta. So this is all fine and good. If Rebbe says that even by kzayis l'macha b'chutz, Rabbi Yehuda still says Tfos lashon rishon even there. Okay, then obviously also by kzayis v'kzayis he would say Tfos lashon rishon. So koshkin kzayis v'chazayis, right? Meaning so kzayis Tfos lashon rishon, and also even kzayis v'chazayis, and even kzayis l'macha b'chutz. So if by the most extreme case of there's one kzayis l'macha b'chutz, still Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, so certainly by kzayis v'chazayis. But Eli Amar Le Klala. But if when Levi asks Rebbe about kzayis l'macha b'chutz, Rebbe says eruv machshavis, he doesn't say Tfos lashon rishon, well then akati kzayis v'chazayis mibarle. Levi is still going to have to ask, is still going to have to follow up and say, okay, fine. So if kzayis l'macha b'chutz, Rebbe doesn't say, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say Tfos lashon rishon, what would he say by kzayis v'chazayis? Would he say Tfos lashon rishon there? But the Gemara says, no, not necessarily, because it's actually what Levi did was brilliant. You know why? Because if the answer was that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say Tfos lashon rishon, both, right? And he says eruv machshavas, both by kzayis l'macha b'chutz as well as by kzayis v'chazayis, Rebbe would have gotten upset. He would have said to Levi, why are you asking me about kzayis l'macha b'chutz? You should ask me about kzayis v'chazayis. Rabbi Yehuda already says eruv machshavas. Why are you asking me about kzayis l'macha b'chutz? So it's brilliant. Basically, what Levi did was he asked about kzayis l'macha b'chutz because it's one question that based on Rebbe's reaction, Levi would be able to get all the information that he needs. If Rebbe says that even there, Rabbi Yehuda says Tfos lashon rishon, well then certainly by kzayis v'chazayis, Tfos lashon rishon. If he kind of in a chilled out way, if he says like exactly what happened, that's a brilliant question. By kzayis l'macha b'chutz, Rabbi Yehuda says eruv machshavis, and kind of and Rebbe's like chilled out when he says it. It means okay, it really is a brilliant question, and because it's davka there by kzayis l'macha b'chutz, the Rabbi Yehuda says eruv machshavis. But by kzayis v'chazayis, he would still say Tfos lashon rishon. And if Rebbe gets upset and he says, "Why are you asking me about kzayis l'macha b'chutz?" Rabbi Yehuda already says eruv machshavas even by kzayis v'chazayis. Well then, Levi would also know he would have his answer about kzayis v'kzayis as well. So by asking about kzayis l'machar b'chutz, Levi knew that he would be able to get all the information that he needs about both kzayis v'kzayis as well as kzayis l'machar b'chutz. Hashta kzayis v'kzayis klala, kzayis l'machar b'chutz mibaya, right? That if it was Eruv Machshavas both by kzayis l'machar b'chutz as well as kzayis v'kzayis, Rebbe would have gotten upset and says, why are you asking me about kzayis l'machar b'chutz when it's even Eruv Machshavas by kzayis v'chazayis. Wow, friends, that was Daf Lamed of Masechtas Zevachim. I think that was a really long Daf. Shabbos, I have now an hour and 15 minutes to, first of all, I have to do a conclusion, but I have an hour and 15 minutes to get this recording onto my computer, edit it, and upload it. Wish me luck. All right, friends. So on Daf Lamed, the first thing that we learned about was a Mishnah where we learned about Karev hamatir mitzvaso. This is kind of the evolution of Pigul, and that in order for it to be chayiv kares, you have a machshava. You have to have essentially purely a machshava of chutz lizmano. If you also have another machshava of chutz limkomo or by chatos and korban pesach shelo lishma, so then it would be low karev hamatir mitzvaso, and you would not be chayiv kares. You only chayiv kares if you have machshavas chutz lizmano, and that is it. All the other matirin were either with that same machshavas pigul or with no special machshava at all. And then at the end of that Mishnah, we got to the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim regarding Tfos, lashon, rishon. So if he says, for example, kzayis lemachar, kzayis b'chutz, he first has a kavan of chutz lizmano, and then he has a kavan of chutz limkomo. So the rabbis say it would be posel, whereas Rabbi Yehuda says it would be pigul, and you'd be chayiv kares. So now, then we had, basically that was the focus of the daf. So the first part of the Gemara says, Tfos, lashon, rishon, is it by one avodas or two avodas? That when Rabbi Yehuda says, Tfos, lashon, rishon, is it when it's two distinct avodas, and he says you go by the kavanah by the first avodah, or even for one avodah, let's say shchita, to say that you can have two machshavas, and we'll go based on Tfos, lashon, rishon. So Ilfa says, Rabbi Yehuda only says Tfos, lashon, rishon when you have two machshavas for two different avodas, whereas Rabbi Yochanan says even just with one avodah, for example, shchita, you can have two kavanas of both, right? You can have chutz lizmano and chutz limkomo, and we would go with chutz lizmano, Tfos, lashon, rishon, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Then we discussed Tfos, lashon, rishon, two thoughts for one avodah. That got into like Levi the sheep, when you have by the machlokas Reb Meir and Reb Yossi, by temurah, if you have kavanah of temurah's ola, and right for half of the sheep, and temurah shlamim for half of the sheep, would Reb Yehuda still say Tfos, lashon, rishon there? So Abaye says nope. You've reached the limits of Tfos, lashon, rishon. Tfos, lashon, rishon wouldn't go that far, as Levi the sheep being both a temurah's ola and temurah's shlamim. Whereas Rava says no, even by Levi the sheep being half temurah's ola and half temurah's shlamim, actually, if you say Tfos, lashon, rishon, you would say it's temurah's ola alone, because you go based on the first one. Then we got into the machlokas, right? So this machlokas of Meir versus Reb Yossi by temurah. When it says Areza temurah's ola, temurah's shlamim, Reb Meir says it's temurah's ola. Reb Yossi says it is both, and you have to let it graze until it gets a mum. So Rav Dimi says that Reb Meir agrees with Reb Yehuda that Tfos, lashon, rishon, and that's why he says Areza temurah's ola. Rav Bar Chana says in the name of Reb Yochanan that Reb Meir agrees with Reb Yossi that no Tfos, lashon, rishon, and what they were arguing was a technicality about what exactly he means when he says Areza temurah's ola, temurah's shlamim. Is he replacing his initial thought, like Reb Meir says, and that's why he says Areza temurah's ola, because you can't replace the initial temurah's ola? Or is it like Rabbi Yossi says, no, he's actually intending both temurah's ola and temurah's shlamim, that's why you let it graze until it gets a mum. And finally, Tfos, lashon, rishon, two thoughts for one kzayis. What happens when you say kzayis lemachar b'chutz? Would Rebbe Yehuda still say Tfos, lashon, rishon there? And Rebbe says no. That is where it reached our limit. At that point, Rebbe Yehuda would agree with Eruv Machshavas there. Friends, I have a lot to do before Shabbos, and this must have been a big daf. I hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you later. Cheers.